Excellent.
There we
Wonderful.
go.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time, and I'll try not to be too long-winded here because I know you have read my bio, but I do want to walk you a little bit through my career path, because I feel, just to give you a little bit of idea of how I thought about how I thought when I made changes, when I pursued different things. So I started my undergraduate at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Human Kinetics and Leisure Studies, and my original plan was actually to work for Parks Canada, if you can imagine. This changed, however, when I traveled to Khartoum, Sudan. And there in 1989, I saw the hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees who had fled the famine in the Horn of Africa. And I met a lot of these international aid workers who were trying to address the crisis. And it really had a sort of an impact on me. I was someone from Kingston who'd never really traveled anywhere other than the United States. And I had traveled all the way around the world to Khartoum to actually visit a friend. And I have to tell you, it was one of those things where it was just an opportunity, and I did it. And, I had never seen such a country so different from my own. I mean, we were in the middle of the Sahara Desert, to put it lightly. So that was sort of that pivotal point. Now, I think with a lot of you've decided to pursue international development, and it is a career path now. And maybe many of you already have volunteered or traveled and see more of the world. But I think back in the late 80s, if you can imagine, there was no internet, there were no mobile phones. I mean, it was much harder to get a sense of what was going on sometimes in some corners of the world. So following that, in 1990, I volunteered. So I started out as a volunteer. I volunteered with an NGO, and I will say to you later, I do believe this is a great path. Even today, when people hear that I was a volunteer in Afghanistan back in the 90s, it just gives them a sense of, I understand what it means to be in the deep field, if I could call it that, or really that passion that I went to a place that was difficult, and I worked there, and I was at a more grassroots level of things going on. So for those of you who may not remember, the situation in 1989, the Russians had just left after invading Afghanistan for about 10 years, and they had a lot of landmines. And so Halo Trust, which is a British NGO, they started out in Afghanistan. Now they're all over the world today. But they train local nationals to remove landmines. And so there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of landmines. My boss had the map for where these landmines were, but snow melt and different kinds of things shifted these landmines. So it really was a big effort. And I was an administrative volunteer. So I was going to procure our fuel because it was rationed. I was booking tickets in the country for staff to go up country. I was doing the banking, and the banking was interesting in particular because I would literally go to the money market in Kabul. I would take my 10,000 pound sterling check and I would cash it in, and one of these merchants who would take the check and give me AFS, which at the time was, highly undervalued, if I could call it that, to say the least. And I would end up with a pillowcase full of AFS, and I would go to the bank and put those in the bank so that we could have our running costs for the month. So it really was, almost in the dark ages when I think back about it. But I really enjoyed working with the Afghans, and I really felt that sense of purpose of helping people help themselves. And I think that really was a pivotal experience as well. And I think non-governmental organizations most of the time are really at the grassroots of international development. And I think it is important to have experiences with them. And some of my colleagues and friends still work with NGOs today. They feel very strongly about the work that they do. And I'll talk about NGOs in a few minutes. At Halo Trust, I realized that I really, I like the challenge of operations. And so, that sort of hiring of staff, day-to-day logistics, managing of funds. So I knew I needed more educational experience, and I knew I needed more background. So I went back to Canada, and I actually decided to do a Master's of Business Administration. And I ended up at Rotman School of Management in Toronto. And I think one of the reasons I chose Toronto was because I remember it said 30% of the students will be international. I thought, well, that's great. I mean, I want to learn more about different cultures and different countries, and I would love to do my MBA with international students for the most part. So that was one change that I made to have more education. And I'll come back to this idea of assessing what education you need for what you are trying to do. Now, many of you are focusing on international development, and it may be as a master's, it may be piggybacking on another area of expertise you have, or as an undergraduate, you may need to do a master's in something more specialized. So I would just say you need to think about that, because that will be something that will keep your opportunities perhaps in the area you want, or wider or narrower. So it does have an influence. Now, working in the area of operations obviously is very wide. It's enabled me to go all over the place in all different organizations, because operational support is always needed. While I was at Rotman, I also did an exchange to France for 4 months. And I'll come back to this idea of languages. And I know you have languages suggested in your program or as part of your program. And I would highly, highly suggest that you look at that. It can only give you more opportunities. And I think it's very important. Many organizations are moving now towards the idea of multilingualism. It just opens more doors. It's being required in many more organizations. It can be a differentiator between the competitive aspect of hiring people in different organizations. So I would just ask that you do think about that. So after graduating from U of T, I traveled to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where I knew the UN was involved in doing this huge effort of organizing the first democratic elections. And I figured if I was on the ground, I could probably find work. So I went there. And, you know, yes, in the day, it was much easier to get visas and to travel, especially as a Canadian. And I did have some friends that I knew there. So I went ahead and went there, and I started looking for work. And within, I would say, a few weeks, I was very fortunate. I found a job with the Office of Project Services, which is part of the United Nations Development Program. They had a huge project going on to resettle and reintegrate all of the hundreds of thousands of Cambodians who had been up on the Thai border for years while the Khmer Rouge regime was in power. And so there was a big effort to reintegrate those people and to resettle them. So UNDP was doing a huge monster infrastructure project where they were building roads, they were building schools, they were repairing bridges, they were looking at water and sanitation, they were looking at wells. So I was a finance and procurement officer. So I had gotten a sort of a short-term position at what we call this professional level 2, which is really the entry level in a lot of the UN organizations. And I didn't know anything about UN finance. I didn't know anything about UN procurement, but I learned. And I think what was quite interesting about that was just sort of getting my foot in the door to see sort of a large scale project, the kinds of more after a crisis, you know. So I think one of the things you'll find in international development is there is this sort of more ongoing development work, such as UNDP, but there are a lot of organizations that deal with crisis, like refugees and others. So just to say there's sort of different kinds of, I guess, states, if you will, or stages, if you will, of what goes on in countries, you know, following crises, you know, where they start to stabilize, and then you have international development work. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at the work in that respect. And I just want to point that out as well. I think it's important to know that as a differentiator. So while I was in Phnom Penh, I discovered that the Canadian government had a local initiatives fund, and this was around $400,000 that they had for small projects. So I took on the coordinator job, and what my day-to-day work was to review projects documents and to help local organizations, Khmer NGOs, come up with project proposals for bilateral funding from the Canadian government to fund their projects. And predominantly they were small business projects. They were starting a sort of either a bee or chicken raising project, or there was all kinds of things that people were doing to sort of get themselves economically stable again after coming back to the country. And just to give you a little bit of information about the Canada Fund, I checked again. I mean, it's now in more than 120 countries, and they have around $16.3 million, and most projects average around 25,000. And the main idea behind it is that local organizations are selected and approved by the Canadian Embassy or High Commission in the country. They're local civil society type of projects. And I think, again, working in that area, I found it totally rewarding because you were helping, again, locals to help themselves. And I ended up going to Rwanda, to Kigali, to do this job with CETA because I enjoyed it so much. And, you know, Kigali was a totally different scenario. It was after the genocide. The country was just trying to kind of come out of the aftermath of that. And I traveled around quite a bit and I supported a lot of organizations. And I found there, the Rwandans were super organized. They already had this sort of culture of small cooperatives. And so I found my job was actually very easy. And I enjoyed the fact that I was facilitating Canada giving them money. And they had to report on it and they had to show results. And I would help them through that process so that, you know, perhaps they could have other funding as they grew as organizations. So in 1999, I got my first job with the UN. I ended up getting a professional level 3 position with the former International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a lot of formers in there, but in The Hague. And essentially the UN Security Council set this up to prosecute war criminals from the former Yugoslavia conflict. And for 6 years, I prepared and implemented and monitored and reported on the budget of the tribunal. And what was interesting about that, it was around 1,500 people that were working in this UN tribunal. But we had a court system, we had a legal system, and we even had a jail. And I once toured the jail and I saw Mr. Milosevic in there, who was one of the sort of most senior people that was implemented in this whole war crimes tribunal. And I found it really fascinating. And, you know, I sort of really realized that in many situations when you work in international development, sometimes you can be part of history in the making, if you could call it that. And it's interesting to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And I think that is one thing that I really enjoy. In 2005, I went to Geneva. I decided I wanted to, you know, stay in Europe. And I found a job with the International Trade Center, which was a really interesting organization co-funded by the UN and by the World Trade Organization. And they were helping countries improve and be able to do sort of expand their exports. So for example, there was a lot of work in Africa and Asia for how to tap into the European market and how to meet the standards for the products so they could sell their products in the market. So tomatoes, for example, or flowers. So again, it was a kind of a little niche organization, and I'm going to come shortly here to show you the big UN family here, because I think it's really important to see how big it is and how all the organizations fit into it. While I was in Geneva, I decided that I really should be moving into a more general area. I felt like I was sort of predominantly focusing on budget and finance, and I felt that it would be nice to go more general. There might be more opportunities. So I applied to a position with one of the 5 regional economic commissions with the UN. So I ended up with the Economic Commission for Europe, and I spent around 6 years with them, and I was supporting the work there. And one of the most unique things about that is they had a huge amount of what we call voluntary contributions. And voluntary contributions are in addition to assessed contributions, and they're provided by organizations like the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, countries themselves, Germany, Switzerland, France, etc. And so I got quite familiar with the whole voluntary project side of the UN and international organizations and partnerships, and working with local partners as well. And I just realized that, you know, it's such a huge, vast sort of arena, if you will. And I think we'll come back to this idea with the present circumstance and how that's impacting. So the ECE was really working predominantly in the areas of environment, transport, and sustainable energy and trade. And it had working parties that were made up of representatives from the different European governments. And they focused a lot on creating policy recommendations that they hoped the governments in Europe would take upon themselves domestically or nationally. And they looked at cross-border pollution, they looked at shared water resources, transportation of goods within the European states, and facilitating that in an easy way. They came up with the carnet system, for example. So it was very much European focused, but I found it, again, really fascinating. And finally, after 10 years in Geneva, I sort of felt the craving of, I don't know, just coming back to North America and also trying to have a go at headquarters in the UN. So it took me about 2 years, because in the UN, you are responsible for your own career. But I ended up coming to New York and working with the head of HR in her front office. And I worked in that job for about 4 years. And then I recently laterally transferred to this job that I'm in now, which I really love, because I'm really doing everything for staff. So I find that it's rewarding in the sense that you're giving back to staff. I tried to keep that fairly brief, but I wanted you to see sort of how I moved through. And, you know, I feel that there's a lot of things you need to think about when you're working internationally. And one is how you manage your spouse, or your partner, how you manage raising children, how you manage moving around. These are all things that are very challenging. They take a lot of dedication and, you know, sort of open discussions in your family. But I think, you know, looking back, you know, I think it can work. And I think it can be very rewarding for families. You become really a unit, and you support one another. And I think the exposure to different places can be particularly interesting for children. It can be a bit more challenging for spouses to find jobs. And so this is something you have to think about, especially when you're starting to work internationally, is how to make that balance. You do leave your home country behind, sometimes for years at a time, with very brief moments of going back. But I think what I have continually stayed in this area for is the people that I've met, and the wonderful, interesting people that are so inspiring, notwithstanding the people that I've worked with. So, you know, I think it can be hugely rewarding, hugely satisfying, sometimes difficult, but you can overcome it with sort of, as I say, being adaptive, being open-minded, you know, having really frank and honest discussions with your family, that kind of thing, with your employer. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about creating a personal roadmap, because I feel that it's important to research where it is you want to go. And so when opportunities come up, you're clear about whether they're the right ones, because sometimes you don't have a lot of time to make up your mind. And I think there's so many organizations, and there's potentially so many regions or countries you can work in. There's many different job families you can work in. So I think it's really important to give some thought to that. And some of you may be very clear on that, and some of you may be still sort of contemplating that. So I would say that, you know, doing some research in this area to see whether you need additional education or skills. The UN right now, for example, any professional job requires a master's. So, you know, you need to be aware of what do people require in the organizations or the entities that you want to work in. You also need to give some thought to languages, because more and more the whole multilingualism side is becoming much more important. And you need to think about if you need language skills. And I think your program does promote this. So bravo to you, because I would say that you do want to look at that, and you do want to think about that. And in my view, it makes you have more opportunities. The more skills, broader exposure you have, the more languages you have, etc. I do think it makes a big difference. Now, I decided I would get the challenge up and out of the way, because I didn't want to end on a negative note. So I wanted to talk about the challenges, because, you know, I think we really need to acknowledge that right now times are not normal. We're living in a fairly difficult time where, you know, there's travel restrictions, but even more importantly, I think you can almost pretty much guess that funding has dried up to a certain extent for many organizations. And I would just tell you about the situation we have in the UN right now. We have had all recruitment, for the most part, frozen since April. And the reason we have is we've been anticipating already that member states who are assessed contributions, who are obliged to pay the UN their assessed contributions for the annual budgets that they approve, are already struggling. And so we have frozen recruitment in order that our controller can assure that we can pay the existing staff their salaries. It's to that situation. We've used up our contingency fund completely. We have big donors who normally would have paid up by now who haven't. And so I can only imagine that for organizations such as, say, the refugee organization, which is predominantly on voluntary contributions, or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, they are also having difficulties because the normal voluntary funds that would have come, countries are redirecting into their own economic domestic issues and trying to deal with this whole COVID crisis. So I think, we have to understand that that's happening. We have to acknowledge that it's a reality. It's not forever, but for the foreseeable, in my view, next year, I think it is going to continue to impact, because there's going to be some time before countries get back to normal and they get back to these situations where they were regularly having voluntary funds, part of their GDP or their budgets going to international organizations, supporting different initiatives and that sort of thing. So I think it's really important to realize that and to know it's going to impact your search for employment. So I'll stop there because I'm sure you might have some questions and I'll answer them the best I can. I'm sure you've all seen this, and if you haven't, you will. The UN recently spearheaded through a fairly deliberative process involving its member states, civil society, to create this set of 17 aspirational global goals. And I think the reason I pull this up is because I think if you're going to work in international development, you need to be aware that this is where many people in the whole ecosystem of international development are focusing their efforts. This gives them something clear to latch onto, to link to work with partners on. So I think what I would say about this is it's important to think about where do your interests lie in this agenda. And I think you need to know that many organizations are striving to work in these areas, and it's even created new areas. For example, for the first time ever, I saw a job for someone who has experience in sustainable development. I mean, this is a new area that is coming about. And so I just think it's important to realize that this is also a driver for the next decade. And many times over the last so many years, decades, the UN has latched onto certain kind of agendas, if you will, to drive their work over the next few decades. And, in 2030, it will probably be that there'll be something else. It'll be reevaluated. But just to say that there is a sort of a frame, if you will, driving much of the work in international development. And I think you just need to be thinking about, if you're focusing on climate action, for example, and what's going on in that space, and what are the skills, what are the jobs that are being advertised, that sort of thing. I think it's important to be thinking about that as well. I pulled up this because I think what's really important, as I said before, is looking at starting with work with a non-governmental organization. I think it's really, in my view, important to work in the grassroots area. I think, it would be wonderful, perhaps if you're in political affairs, to go start working in a place like New York, but that's not really going to show you the real true work of international organizations and NGOs. It really is in the field. And I think this ECOSOC document that I pulled up, and I can certainly, after the talk, I'll share all the links with Marcus and the team so they can circulate them to you. You may be already aware of many of these things, but I tried to look at some resources for you. But this ECOSOC document has the list of non-governmental organizations that are involved in the consultative process with the council. And this is the most recent one from September 1st, 2018. So currently there's 138 organizations in general consultative status with the UN, and there's just over 4,000 in special consultative status, and around 971 on the roster. So there's over 5,000 organizations listed here. The reason I think it's an interesting resource is you can actually use it as a resource to see globally what are all the different NGOs, and is the NGO that you happen to be looking at in there? Because it gives you a certain sense of security knowing that it's involved with international association, with international work. And I think it's important to know, a place where there's a sort of a definitive list, if you will, because you could, now you have the internet, which makes it much easier. But I think this is an important resource that I would suggest having in your repertoire for looking at work internationally. I have a few more that I just identified that have come up in my travels, and a couple of them are Canadian actually, and VSO I came across in my travels in Cambodia, and I wanted to mention about the High Commission for Refugees, just as some special additional resources. So in addition to this ECOSOC publication, I don't know if you are aware of CanADEM, and I suspect maybe some of you are. But CanADEM is an international not-for-profit NGO dedicated to advancing international peace and security through the rostering, rapid mobilization, and mission management of experts committed to international service. And when they first started getting set up back, I believe it was around 1996, or maybe it was slightly later, but CanADEM works in partnership with the Government of Canada, the Government of the UK, many UN organizations, international organizations, and national governments to set up deployment projects designed to inject civilian expertise where it's needed. And I think, they focus mainly on peace building, humanitarian relief, and development. And I know whenever there's an election, they definitely help with finding volunteers and people to work on carrying out elections. But just, you can get yourself rostered in there, I think. And I would have a good look at that site if you haven't already. Another interesting one is IDRC, which is the International Development Research Center. I also came across them in Cambodia years ago, but it's part of Canada's foreign affairs and development efforts, and it invests in knowledge, innovation, and solutions to improve the lives of people in the developing world. And they offer grants and funding and awards to researchers and institutions to find solutions for global development challenges. And I think, again, back to your interests, maybe your interest is research. So this would be an interesting organization to look at, and look at what projects that they have funded. They list on their site some 2,000 projects from the past decade. So you certainly could look at what they have focused on and what they have funded. And you may find that there's some interesting information there that you would like to look into further. The volunteer service organization, I came across them in Cambodia as well. Cambodia had a huge amount of different organizations descend upon it when the Khmer Rouge pulled out. And, it was sort of when mobile phones first started coming in. I remember having one of these big bricks as a mobile phone and, traveling around the city by cyclo because there wasn't a lot of cars, and it seemed kind of crazy at the time. But there was a huge number of organizations that came to help out there. And I think the VSO was very interesting because they really are about empowering people to make, they don't send aid, they send people, but they're about empowering change. And I highlight them because I like their philosophy. And then I put down the UNHCR because they also have strategic partnerships with about 900 different NGOs. So again, I think their site is worth looking at just to see the partnerships that they've identified, which would probably be a subset of the larger ECOSOC group, but I think it would be interesting to see what and who they're partnering with. Now, I want to focus on some other volunteer areas because I think, again, given the scenario we're in, the pandemic, I think volunteers are always going to be required. And so I think that may be a good place to start for some of you if you're finding difficulties. So it's possible to also volunteer with the UN as a volunteer, and UNV is still supporting many volunteers around the globe, even in the COVID pandemic. So I think it's important to know they're still carrying on, and they have, I think right now, around, I think it's 6,000 volunteers and 50 entity partners worldwide right now. So it's probably a few less entities than they've had traditionally. But just to say that they look at qualified and experienced people from many different nationalities to volunteer for at least 6 months to help others. And they look at a variety of professional backgrounds. So when I was in Cambodia with the UNDP project, I had 4 UNVs who were doing the financial accounts of each of our 4 field offices up country in Cambodia. And each month they would send down the accounts, and then I would send up the money, and they were volunteering to get more experience. And I came across one of them about a year ago who was a chief of finance in a mission in Africa. And it was just so nice to see that after that volunteer experience, he ended up pursuing a career and ended up actually, after a number of years, really doing well. So it can lead to many different other things. And I think the one thing that is nice about UNV is they cover basic needs, housing, utilities. They give you a settling in grant, some life, health, and disability insurance, return airfare, and some nominal resettlement allowance. So I think just to say, well, you don't get a salary, you'll get everything else sort of covered. So it's kind of nice in that respect. And many NGOs also do the same thing. When I was with the Halo Trust, I mean, I had my meals provided and I had a stipend and they paid for my ticket, but I mean, I didn't get a salary. So I think many times you'll find that there are some basic elements covered. I've brought this one up in case you're not aware of this one. This is an online one. And I think what there is there's assignments that you can be chosen for. So you can list yourself there, and you can look at helping different individuals and organizations affiliated with the UN around the world who are looking for support on assignments, and you don't need to travel. So I pulled that one up as well. Now this is an interesting one, and I don't know if you have seen it. If you've been exploring around the UN site, you probably have. But I pull it up because I think it's important to see the entire, what I would call, UN system in one go. So I can certainly share the link with all of you on this. This is what I would call the UN family. And what's interesting about it is you can see in the green, we have a number of things called funds and programs. So this is a group that is sort of outside what I would call the UN Secretariat. There's the UNDP, World Food Program. We have the High Commissioner for Refugees, UN Habitat. These are all independent agencies, funds, and programs. And the reason I think it's important to see the differentiation between the groups is they all have their own way of recruiting, and they all have their own websites. And in some cases, they have different regulations and rules, and in some cases, they follow the UN Secretariat. I also find this diagram helpful because it sort of puts into perspective where something falls. So for example, here in the blue, you can see the regional commissions, which are under the Economic and Social Council. And this is where ECE that I worked for fell. So I think it's just also interesting to see the sort of where these come from in terms of the UN principal organs. And then in the bottom here, you see all the departments and offices, which are part of the UN Secretariat. So right now, I am in the, well, I have the Department of Management, which has actually just been recently reformed, so we have a slightly different name now. But all the UN departments that are under the Secretariat. And I think this diagram allows you to see sort of other specialized agencies like World Tourism, World Health, World Intellectual Property, all of these other little specialized agencies as well, because they all have, in many cases, different governing bodies whereas the UN Secretariat has the General Assembly. So they're all funded by their own governing bodies in some cases, or in other cases like the Secretariat, they have assessed contributions of all 193 member states. And it has a different mechanism, if you will. So I think it's important to see the whole family, if I could call it that, of organizations. I'm mindful I'm getting too long in my talking, so I'm going to skip a little bit over the next few slides. I think suffice it to say that many organizations have internships. Most are not paid. However, there are more and more that are paid. So I will share with you those organizations where they are paid, such as the World Health, UNDP, UNICEF, World Food, and UN Population Fund. They all have paid internships. And normally these can be from 2 to 6 months and require normally a master's, but we have relaxed a little bit. In some cases, the Secretariat now takes you, if you finished your last year, you're in your 4th year or you just finished your undergraduate. But I would say normally in the competitive world of internships, people with masters tend to get them. The last category I want to talk about is the Young Professional Program, and this is unique to the Secretariat. And the reason I want to bring it up is because the diagram that I just showed you with all of the UN organizations, many of those have no restrictions on what we call the professional level 2 entry level. But the Secretariat has a young professional program, which is used to enable a mechanism to have unrepresented and underrepresented countries. So Canada never is on there, but if some of you have dual nationality or of other nationalities, you would find that you may be able to be eligible. And every year in September it opens, and they have certain job families that it's open to that the UN needs to recruit for, and the list of nationalities. And if you qualify, you can apply and you go through a process of interviewing and testing, etc. But it is a professional track. And if you come in through that track, you are more or less understood. So long as you perform well within the first 2 years, you are on a career path in the UN. Good. I'm going to stop there and stop sharing. And I'm sorry, I talked a little longer than I would have liked, but I will be happy to talk questions a little longer.
Not a problem, but we'll move then. Thank you so much, Leslie. We will move to open it to the floor. If you have a question, either you find the raise hand button and I'll call upon you, or you can just either type "I have a question" into the chat box and we'll come to you, or you can type the question into the chat box. So please don't be shy. Leslie's here and has massive amount of experience and expertise in this field. So if you wish for her to elaborate on any of the things she raised, please put your hand up now.
And there are no bad questions.
Absolutely.
There's no dumb questions either. There's all good questions.
So Megan, over to you. Do you want to unmute and ask your question live? Wonderful. Excellent. Megan, please go right ahead.
Hi, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you for this seminar. It's been really great. I've been looking forward to it all week. My question kind of is to both of you, actually. I was looking at Devs 410 and 420, which is like the placement course throughout the summer, and I was wondering if any of the placements Leslie was talking about are similar to the placements you could take in the 3rd and 4th year.
Well, that is a good question. Leslie, I think you looked at us a little bit and you'd noticed that we have this 410, 411, yeah, which is basically 9 units of 3 courses, and it guides students through. They prep in the leading up to the potential to go abroad or to work in Canada within the NGO sector generally, or an international institution setting. And then the 411 part is reflection on return. And so it's guided by a faculty member the whole way through. And in that first part of the 410, there's a guided process of where to look for potential opportunities and so forth. So generally, this has often looked at NGO type placements, but some of them have been through the UN agency.
Okay.
I know that Leslie's colleague Andrew Russell has taken a number of their students in the past into the UN system, working in areas such as Kosovo, as we're talking about former Yugoslavia and so forth. So whilst this isn't my domain, I don't have the full expertise on 410, not having taught it, I know there are precedents for it. Any thoughts on that, Leslie? The work placement of it has to happen over the summer because students go away and then they come back and reflect on it. So it's that summer between third year and fourth year of the undergraduate.
Yep. I mean, I would say that, you know, definitely the NGO side, and again, you know, thinking about this upcoming summer, I would say, I suspect that there's a lot of people doing things remotely. And I think we have to be aware that that's probably a big possibility. And I know in terms of interns, I mean, so long as you would be in your fourth year or had just completed your fourth year, you definitely could be eligible for internships with the UN. And I think, you know, just for example, I just took somebody on board who decided to defer going to a master's program, and she's working at home. And, you know, in a way, the whole remoteness working is a bit of a game changer, because it used to be to take an internship, you had to cover some of your costs to go wherever you were going to go because you weren't paid. So I think in a way, it's a game changer. And the large number of internships are usually in the summer. But I would also say that given the freeze on hiring, obviously, there's a lot of interesting things to do. I mean, the intern I hired recently, I'm going to have her help us with a whole stakeholder review and communication review for a new performance management system we're launching. And for her, it just gives her a general skill. She's going into a master's of public health, but it allows her a general skill. So I would say to you, it's worth assessing different possibilities. One, because you may not have to travel this summer and if you're doing this, but I would say that internships at the UN and the agencies would be something I think you could consider. But I also think NGOs as well, because you may not have to have travel expenses. It's much easier to be working on something, and you know, you just need to be able to connect. You need to be a little bit sort of taking initiative. But it, you know, I think there's different possibilities as we come into this summer coming up. If the pandemic is still, you know, an issue for us, you know. I hope that answers, but tell me if there's something you want me to elaborate on more.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm actually only in second year, so it'd be in a couple of years, but
yep.
I was more so interested in if that was possible to link to the UN, because I liked seeing all the different branches that are possible.
Yeah, I would say for preparing for that, I would start looking at the various different sites of the organizations. And again, I'll share with Marcus and the team the links that I have in the organizations that have paid internships, because I think the internships are all over the world in the UN Secretariat and in many of the other agencies, funds, and programs that have internships as well. So I think an internship is a good way to see if this is something you like. Likewise with NGOs, it's a way to see if you enjoy that kind of work. And I think it is important to see where you're going to fall on this spectrum, if I could call it that, because it is a big spectrum.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That's great. And one of the comments in the chat is from Alyssa, who did do the 410, 411 this past summer. And many people that were enrolled in it did find remote working opportunities, a lot with Kingston-based NGOs working on Kingston issues as well, and all Canadian-based things. So there's certainly, it still went ahead despite what everyone worried about, you know, this past summer. So I feel that there's certainly opportunities for the summer ahead. And clearly for yourself, Megan, you know, in 2 years, one would hope that there will be plenty. There's two other questions in the chat box. I'm going to go to the one which seems more immediately straight ahead, which is from Shivangi. And Shivangi says, you mentioned a few times how vital a master's degree is to receive entry-level job in international development. Are there other degrees also widely accepted to work, such as the law degree? Would that be a substitution? Leslie?
Well, I would say a law degree I'm always completely amazed at how many of my colleagues have law degrees. A law degree is an excellent degree because it's again, there's a lot of people in human resources with law degrees. There's a lot of people in the contract management and procurement with law degrees. There's a lot of people in the Office of Legal Affairs with law degrees. There are a huge number of lawyers in human rights. Lawyers are everywhere. So I would say law is an excellent thing to go into. You can have transferable skills in many, many different areas. And I would really suggest having a look at some of the job families that not only in the UN, but in other organizations, the job families, it's incredible. There's even an organization for outer space. I mean, it's huge. So as I say, the world is your oyster. It's really, in my view, trying to figure out where in this huge sort of stellar system do you want to go? Because there's so many combinations. And so law, in my view, if you want to have that sort of possibility of maybe doing that as a career and combining your international development in some way, I mean, there's certainly lots of different things over border disputes, all sorts of things. So I would say, absolutely, there are other degrees. I would say you might even be more marketable with a combination of your international development with something else. I would probably say that would enable you to kind of go in some direction, whether it's your undergraduates and something else and you combine it with the international development, or the other way around. I would say that you would be, in my view, stronger, broader if you had that, at least in my view. Back to you, Marcus.
Oh, no, absolutely. Another question here was from Victoria, and Victoria is interested to know if, looking back, was there anything you wished you knew, positive and negative, prior to beginning a career in development? I'm guessing that could be quite a long list, actually. But what do you think? What do you think the young Leslie would have most benefited from had you known it then?
I think I definitely would have, I definitely would have gotten other languages. I mean, there's been so many times I would have loved to have gone to South America for a post, and I can't because I have no Spanish. I think the language is the big differentiator. And I think, having lived in Geneva for 10 years, I mean, it's shocking, the Swiss. I mean, they speak 4 languages. So you're competing with people who have 2, 3, 4 languages. And I'm not saying language is the only thing, but it really allows you much more opportunities. And in my view, the more general things you have, the more skills you have, the more languages you have, the more opportunities you have. So that would be one thing I would say. I think, one thing I realized is a lot of times, and maybe this is because we didn't have the internet. You all have the internet now, but sometimes in hindsight, I wished, why didn't I research more thoroughly the countries I went to before I went to them? I would land, and really not know anything and just kind of experience it. And then it would be after I would spend, a lot more time reading and, finding out more about the history. And maybe that's just being not a child of the internet, but, I certainly would have preferred if I had done more research up front. And maybe it just wasn't as easy back then, but I would say definitely today I would be researching more to know the history, because sometimes understanding the history of a scenario, and Rwanda is a case in point. I mean, it was such a long sort of history there of, colonialism and all sorts of things, tribalism and so many things that I just really was not aware of until I got there and started understanding. So I would definitely research more. That would be the 2 things I would say. Yeah.
I'd like to think that if one thing our degree really drives home is that point of understanding the context through that kind of a sort of interdisciplinary analysis, including the long history to these kind of things. So that is hopefully one of the things we're driving before, so it's good to hear you say that. Aidan was keen to, you mentioned language, and I totally agree. He's just wondering what sort of level of proficiency would be sort of necessary. Is it a case where a bit of proficiency in a number of language, or is it like, you know, semi-fluency or complete fluency in one or two? What's your take on that, Leslie?
I mean, I would say predominantly, I mean, you know, the UN perpetuates 6 languages, but obviously there's many, many local dialects. And, you know, when I was in Afghanistan, one thing I did do is I did find a language teacher to teach me the Dari language, so that I could at least have some basic, you know, sort of understanding. And I think it goes a long way when you have that. But I think, you know, in terms of broader languages that are required, I mean, I definitely think English, French, and Spanish are definitely 3 languages that are used predominantly throughout the whole world in many different areas. So I would definitely say having some ability in those. I know the world is changing and English is everywhere, but I think I found when I went to Rwanda at that time, there was much more French spoken. And so I was able to definitely benefit from having the, you know, the Rwandans had French as a second language, and so did I. That just really worked wonderfully. You know, and I think just having that ability to converse with people a little bit in their own language. So, you know, when you arrive somewhere trying to take some of the local language, I would always say that's really useful as well. So I think having the multilingualism in the sort of more official, broader languages it would be good to have not, I don't think written fluency, but I think some speaking and reading fluency is definitely, you know, important. And I know if you have some language ability, I would definitely brush up on some of that if you can. I think it does help a lot, even getting some proficiency, say in French or Spanish. But the willingness to learn a local language to a certain level, I think is good. Just, you know, being able to say thank you and greetings and numbers and going to the market and that kind of thing. I think it's really important.
It is interesting, you know, to think that if your CV shows that you've got even to a, you know, a moderate level, a number of languages, it shows that there's a pathway to learning more as needed as well, right? So it's very good sort of symbolically to suggest that you have a certain proficiency in languages on that score. And I take the note to self that it's really time to invest in bringing my Spanish back and French back up to the sort of levels it used to be, that have fallen by the wayside through lack of use over the last decade. So that's cool. I see time is sort of getting, we're past the 3 o'clock mark, and I'm aware that Leslie's joined us on a Friday afternoon from just before Thanksgiving in the States. If there's any more questions, one thing I'd just like to say is that, just to reinforce that Leslie mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals as something that you guys should be familiarizing yourself with and referencing, because a lot of jobs, so job opportunities, internships, volunteer, are actually going to be framed around those things. This is going to be increasingly important. Just as a mark of this, our principal here at Queen's, as you may well know, has signed Queen's up to the Times Higher Education ranking system, which is based absolutely on the SDGs. And so right at the moment, Queen's is starting to work out how it's going to basically audit the entirety of our educational pedagogical apparatus according to how it contributes to SDG goals, outcomes, etc. I'm part of some of these committees that are discussing this at the moment, and it came out of the blue because no one quite knew that the principal was going to do this. But it actually means the you know, departments and of course Devs is quite well set up for this, will need to justify, at least to a certain extent, what they do and their outcomes of their pedagogical programs in terms of how they contribute to SDGs. So it's going to have an impact over the next 10 years right here at Queen's, and by sure it's going to affect the kinds of job markets that you guys are applying into. So I just really wanted to reinforce what Leslie was saying there, because I think, yeah, absolutely, if you can, when you're thinking of writing cover letters for internships, etc., even if it doesn't, you know, the position isn't actually explicitly saying SDGs, you get them in there.
Exactly.
You write them in and say, I see that your job ad like speaks to SDG this and this, and I feel, you know, showing that compatibility, I think is really important. I think that's a really key thing.
Yeah, and I think you know, just what I've noticed now is, you know, most NGOs, most international organizations are seeing where they fit in that, because it sort of allows them then more opportunities for partnering, for funding, for all sorts of things. So it really is a frame that everyone's using. And you know, I think we had the millennial development goals before that, you know, so I mean, it'll have a new reiteration, but there's always a frame that's sort of driving things, you know.
It
Just,
is,
I
and
think
it's
that's
got 10 years to run, right? So this
exactly.
one will be with us for a while before they move on to the
Yeah,
MSDGs or whatever will come next. But
exactly. And I think, you know, the whole sort of, you know, the gender parity thing, you know, the diversity, all of these things are really also weaving into the UN as well, and many organizations. But I think they will definitely drive it for the next decade. So I'm thinking most of the people here are going to be either, you know, really getting into the workforce, or fairly soon afterwards getting into the workforce. So yeah.
no, it's true, but even including at the NGO level, at the grassroots level, as Leslie mentioned, many of those organizations need to wrap their funding applications, where they look for funding or contracts, etc., around SDG language. So if they have job applicants that are already doing that for themselves, they're likely to go, oh yeah, this is the person we want writing this grant application, because clearly they have a huge familiarity with the kinds of rubrics which are making which count towards funding decisions at the next level. So I'm definitely, yeah, I'm seeing the importance of that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions from the floor for Leslie? We have time perhaps just for one more if there was one. If not, then please join me with a virtual thank you to Leslie for joining us. Thank you so much. It's been really great to hear you speak.
You're
And thanks to everyone for joining in on a Friday afternoon. We will find a way to share the resources that Leslie will share with you.
Yep.
And Leslie, I look forward to seeing you in Kingston at some point, hopefully
Yes,
in
definitely.
the not too distant future, although we're all prisoners to circumstances beyond our individual trajectories. But
no, it's true. And I think, you know, certainly if there's anything, you know, if any of the students have any other areas that they're interested in having a few links to, or just let me know, because I've tried to put myself in their shoes to think what would be useful, but I may have missed the mark on something. So if there's something that they want to know more about, I'd be certainly helping if I can. So let me know that as well. But I really have enjoyed sharing with you, and hopefully giving you some ideas that you didn't already have. But if I've missed something, let Marcus know, and if I can share any other resources, I'll be happy to do so.
Well, Leslie, if you missed something, we'll call you back for another talk sometime in the future.
Sure, absolutely. Be happy to do so.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Have a good
welcome.
weekend, and thanks so much for your time. It's a real privilege to be able to listen to you. Thanks so much, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much, everyone, Devs DSD and everyone else. And we'll be seeing everyone virtually, probably in the weeks ahead. Good luck with the end of the term, all the students, okay?
Yes, likewise. Have a good rest of the weekend, and enjoy your Christmas. And yes, we'll probably talk again soon. Take care.
Excellent. Thank you.